Racist cop arrests elderly black veteran in wheelchair. What happens next will shock you. Our story begins at a modest grocery store, with a worn-out parking lot and a faded storefront sign that tells you everything you need to know about this community. Hardworking, honest, but struggling to make ends meet. On this particular day, an elderly black woman rolled herself across the cracked pavement in a squeaky wheelchair, heading toward the sliding doors. Her name was Mrs. Lillian Carter, 82 years old, widowed, a veteran. But to the world, she was just another old lady, unremarkable to most. That is, until you looked a little closer. Mrs. Carter had a sharpness in her eyes, a quiet strength that spoke volumes about the life she'd lived. She had served this country decades ago, breaking barriers at a time when black women in uniform faced both racism and sexism. Yet here she was, relying on her wheelchair and a meager pension to get through her golden years. That day, she had come to the store for the basics: bread, milk, and cat food. Simple needs, nothing unusual. But what happened next would change everything. As Mrs. Carter maneuvered through the aisles, humming softly to herself, a police officer entered the store. Officer Brad Hastings, young, white, and exuding the swagger of unchecked power, wasn't there to buy groceries. His eyes scanned the aisles, sharp and predatory, until his focus landed on Mrs. Carter. What happened in his mind at that moment, we'll never know for sure. But witnesses later said his demeanor changed instantly, like a predator locking on to prey. Maybe it was her skin color, maybe it was her wheelchair, or maybe it was a toxic mix of both. But one thing was clear. He had decided that Mrs. Carter was guilty of something. Unaware of the officer's attention, Mrs. Carter paid for her groceries at the counter. The young clerk smiled warmly, offering to help her outside. But before Mrs. Carter could reach the exit, Officer Hastings stepped in front of her wheelchair, blocking her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "I need to see your receipt." Startled, Mrs. Carter fumbled with her bag. "Of course, officer," she said softly, her hands trembling as she handed over the crumpled receipt. Hastings glanced at it, but didn't return it. Instead, he leaned down, invading her space. "Where's the rest of it?" he barked. Confused, Mrs. Carter blinked. "The rest of what?" Hastings straightened up, his hand resting ominously on his belt. "Don't play games with me, lady. I know what you people do. Stealing from stores, hiding stuff under those chairs." The room seemed to freeze. Shoppers stopped in their tracks, eyes darting between the frail, elderly woman and the towering officer. A pregnant silence hung thick in the air. "I didn't steal anything," Mrs. Carter said, her voice trembling but firm. "Check my bags if you like." But that wasn't enough for Hastings. He grabbed her bag and yanked it open, disregarding her consent. Bread, milk, cat food, nothing else. His face twisted in frustration, as if he couldn't believe he hadn't caught her. Then, he did the unthinkable. Without warning, he grabbed the handles of her wheelchair, spinning her around. Mrs. Carter gasped, crying out, "What are you doing? Let me go!" But Hastings didn't listen. He slapped handcuffs onto her frail wrists, the metal biting into her thin skin. "You're under arrest," he sneered, dragging her toward the door. "For what?" Mrs. Carter protested, tears streaming down her face as she resisted. "This is a lawful order," he snapped. By now, a crowd had gathered, phones out, recording every moment. Shouts of "Leave her alone," and "What's wrong with you?" rang out, but Hastings didn't stop. He hauled Mrs. Carter outside, her wheelchair jerking violently over the uneven pavement. Then, just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, a voice cut through the chaos. "Officer, what are you doing?" A man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence. Dressed in civilian clothes, his badge gleamed in the sunlight. Sergeant Daniel Moore, black and decorated, Hastings' superior. Moore's eyes locked onto Mrs. Carter, and his expression shifted from confusion to horror. "Let her go," he said, his voice low but steady. Hastings hesitated, his arrogance faltering. She was stealing, he mumbled, but more interrupted, his voice rising. Do you even know who this woman is? Hastings froze as Moore stepped closer, his gaze piercing. This is Lillian Carter. She served this country before you were even born. She fought for your freedom, and this is how you repay her. The crowd erupted in support, their shouts echoing through the parking lot. Hastings, now visibly sweating, released Mrs. Carter from the cuff. But the damage was done. Tears streamed down her face as Moore knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry, ma'am, he said softly. This should never have happened. The video of the incident went viral within hours. Millions watched in outrage as the footage spread across social media. Protests erupted, demanding accountability for Hastings' actions and justice for Mrs. Carter. In the days that followed, Hastings was suspended, and an investigation was launched. But the story didn't end there. Mrs. Carter's courage and dignity sparked a nationwide conversation about systemic racism and police brutality, especially toward the most vulnerable among us. Sometimes, it only takes one moment of injustice to ignite a movement. And Mrs. Lillian Carter, a humble veteran in a squeaky wheelchair, became a symbol of that fight. Because justice doesn't rest, equality doesn't wait, and humanity cannot afford to look the other way. If you've watched this far, comment which country you're watching from and leave a 100 in the comment section, because you're the type of person who finishes what they started. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to get notified whenever we drop new videos.